evening, everyone. Welcome to the Churchill Theatre. Sorry for a slight slow start. We didn't expect the fire alarm to go off, but these things do happen. This is like Charlie the Chocolate Factory tonight. You have the golden tickets. There's 353 people in this room. We had 180 on the waiting list, so thank you so much for coming along to hear about this Brexit public meeting. It's certainly the biggest public meeting I've ever done as a Member of Parliament. We've got lots to talk about tonight. If you don't mind me saying, Gordon, we were sold out before we told anyone Gordon Brown was coming. Gordon can't really stay for the whole of the event. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to introduce Gordon. Gordon's going to give us a speech about what his thoughts are on where we are with Brexit. I'm then going to hand over to Daniel Johnson, your member of the Scottish Parliament, who will introduce the panel. All the panel will then speak for a few minutes to give you their own views, and then we'll go to questions. We've got some questions that were submitted in advance, but we'll also take some questions from the audience as well, if I can see you at any point with these lights, but we'll try and see if we can get through that. And we will try and finish on time, but thank you so much for bearing with us. It's been quite a momentous week in Parliament, and I thought maybe we could do a panto tonight on this stage. Nothing will be as bad as what we've seen in Parliament this week. We'll really get on to some of those questions later, but it gives me great pleasure, and I'm so pleased he was able to come to the meeting tonight to introduce the former Member of Parliament for Clondy-Gowan-Beath, but more importantly, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to give us his views on Brexit. Right Honourable Gordon Brown.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I say, first of all, it's a pleasure to speak alongside Ian Murray. He's Scotland's best-known Member of Parliament. He's an assiduous constituency MP. He speaks out on all the major issues. And you know he's a man of compassion who supports social justice. And it's a great pleasure to speak with all the people on this stage tonight. Catherine, who has served so brilliantly in the European Parliament. Daniel, who's serving as the Justice spokesman in the Scottish Parliament. Alex, who's the Member of Parliament for Edinburgh West, and Nicola from Edinburgh University. I think you'll find they're all great Europeans, and what we need now is all great pro-Europeans to speak up and to be counted, and that's why I'm so pleased so many people are here this evening. Now, I started off, as many of you know, in South Edinburgh itself, living in this area, and was a candidate in this area, and was not as successful as Ian in persuading people to vote for me. In fact, the first time I was actually asked to stand when I was a student, I was asked to stand for Edinburgh City Council. And the guy came to me and he said, look, we need a candidate. Would you be prepared to do it? And I said, look, I don't know much about local government finance. You probably think when I was Chancellor, I didn't know much about local government finance. I don't know if I can do this. He said, look, friend, if we were going to win this seat, you wouldn't be the candidate. And he put me very much in my place. Never before has the government been defeated by so many votes in a Parliament. Never before have we seen Parliament so deadlocked for so long that it can't even come to a decision. But you know, never before also have we seen so much disunity in the country itself and so much division. And I think never before, in my experience, have we seen such mounting distrust between Parliament and government and the people of this country. And we're now in a situation where Parliament and the government are not able to resolve the deadlock that they have created. And we are therefore now in extraordinary times. And extraordinary times do, as I found when we had to deal with a financial crisis, need bold leadership, need innovative solutions, and we've got to think not about small political initiatives, as we're seeing with Mrs. May over these next few days. We've got to think of the big picture. And I want to put to you a set of proposals that I think could help not just end the deadlock, but unite the country and end the distrust that is now growing, particularly young people distrusting whether the political system can deliver. And what I would suggest is this, that first we have got to extend Article 50 so that we have a chance to get to a decent decision, because nothing is going to happen in the next few weeks that will end up in anything other than half-baked compromises that I believe no one in this room will support. So we extend the Article 50 for a year, and then I believe we've got to consult the British people and we've got to ask them about all the issues in consultative regional assemblies that we bring together, and I'll explain in a minute how it is done, rather like the Irish did before their abortion referendum, with huge success and international admiration. And stage 2 is therefore holding these consultative assemblies to ask people what they are thinking. The people have got to be brought back into this process. And then Parliament has got to review the evidence and look and see if there is a changed situation. And following on that, I believe there would be a renegotiation that the European Union would be prepared to enter. And I believe that if the situation is changed, then the right thing to do is to put it back to the people so that they can have the final say. And I believe when you have a crisis that is of the nature that we have, you must solve it by bold measures such as I'm putting forward. And I just want to explain why I think the process that I'm proposing is one that could work and could both end the deadlock and unite the country. I studied history, and I look back on all the crises that governments have had to face in the last 200 years. Crises over the Electoral Reform Acts, crises over the Irish question, crises over the reform of the Corn Laws, crises, obviously, as a result of wars, and crises because of our relationships with other countries. And I can think of many instances when it came to the last minute, a minute to midnight, before Parliament and government were able to resolve the issues. But I cannot think of an issue where Parliament was so incapable of resolving the issue that they left people in the dark with a deadlock for month after month after month and year after year. And so I believe we are starting to deal with what is a unique situation, and a unique situation cannot be dealt with simply by looking inwards in Parliament alone. And when you look at the divisions within the country, we are more divided, and I've lived through all of these events, and many of you here will too as well, although most of you are younger than me. I can remember going back to the three-day week of the 1970s and a divided country. But we are more divided than we were then, and more incapable of resolving the division. Divided over, in the 1980s, the miners' strike, divided at the end of the 1980s and the early 90s over the poll tax, divided, again, of course, over the Iraq War. But I think the divisions within our country at the now are not going to be resolved quickly between those who support and those who oppose Brexit unless we take extraordinary measures to do something about it. And I think also of the distrust in the country. And you know, the words that have been bandied around are betrayal and treason. And these are words that are so dramatic and so poisonous and so toxic. But it is true that many people now feel betrayed by the political system. Remainers feel that the Brexit referendum was one that was won by corrupt money and by false promises. And there's truth in that. Leavers think that their promise of a clean break is not being delivered and they're being let down. I worry more about young people thinking that the rest of the community is not thinking about their future and agreeing on a solution that is for them now, but they know will cause damage to young people's futures later. But this language of betrayal is toxic and it's poisonous, and it shows that we must do something that is more dramatic than simply having a few debates in Parliament and a few indicative votes to see what Parliament thinks. And that's why I put my proposals. But you know, there's another reason. And this is what has been the delusion of the Brexiteers and the way they've argued during this period of time. They suggest that there's some sort of quick fix, some sort of clean break that's possible. They compare it to leaving the membership of a club, as if you never have to talk to the people in that club ever again. They compare it to a divorce, as if somehow you can avoid any relationship with the person or the group that you are divorcing yourself from. And of course, it's simply not true. What we're actually doing, when you look at it in detail, and the government is doing it without telling the people that this is what they're actually doing, is we're renegotiating a series of international treaties, many of which have lasted long before we ever joined the European Economic Community, customs arrangements and everything else, many of them part of EFTA rather than the European Union. And we're replacing one set of international arrangements that we've had in treaty form with another set of international relationships. And when pressed, even the hardest of hard Brexiteers would have to accept that we're still going to want to sell goods to Europe and buy goods from Europe. We're still going to want to travel to Europe and travel from Europe. We're still going to want people to study in Europe, in the rest of Europe, I mean in mainland Europe. We're still going to want people to be able to holiday there. We're still going to want our citizens to have the chance to stay there. So this idea that somehow, when you've got to have arrangements for all these things to happen, whether they're customs arrangements or whether they're passport arrangements or whether they're about standards or insurance or about air slots, when you've got all these complex questions that you've got to do, this idea that there's some quick fix, that there's some clean break, that you can think of it as a divorce where you never have to talk to the people in Europe ever again, or think of it as leaving a club and not having to have anything to do with it ever again. This is simply a misleading way of presenting what is the renegotiation of our relationship based on treaties that we have to agree for complex issues. And I think when you think about it this way, and you look at what Conservative ministers are saying, I was thinking today about that Conservative minister. There are so many people who have been minister for Brexit, and it's difficult to think of the last but one, but this is the last minister for Brexit. He was called Rab. In Scotland, we would probably have called him Rab C. Brexit. and he said at Dover that he hadn't understood that there could be a pile-up at Dover. There could be problems at Dover. And he was saying all the time that this is going to be easy and straightforward and we can have a clean break. And that was as much a fantasy and is as much a fantasy as the fantasy of the referendum arguments they put forward that somehow manufacturing would do well under Brexit when it's going to do badly, that somehow the health service would be better off when it's going to be worse off, that somehow our trade with the rest of the world would improve dramatically when it wouldn't, that there would be trade treaties within a few minutes when they're not. All the fantasies that we have got to continue to expose that came from the mouths of those people who were espousing Brexit. And so you see that even if Mrs. May got a deal in the next few days, even if she got it, there's still 2 years of negotiations over the new trading relationship. There's still many more years of negotiations over our relationships that have got to change, obviously, because they're not governed by the European Union with the rest of the world. We've still got a transition period to go through. The idea that somehow you can solve these issues within a few days and you can have a quick fix and there's some compromise that she can dream up over the weekend is simply wrong. You need a proper process so that we can have a decent outcome that can unite the country again. So I'm suggesting extend Article 50. Now, Article 50 is something, obviously, that we triggered. And we could revoke it, but that would be seen as inflammatory with the European Union. So we ought to ask them and agree we should extend it. But to extend it for 3 months is not enough. We've got to have a proper debate within the country that will take longer than that. And of course, we've got to negotiate about what happens because of the European elections and whether we stand or not are candidates in that. But these things are possible because these are the smaller issues in relation to the biggest issue of our time. And then I put forward citizens' national assemblies. Now, look at what happened in Ireland when they had the abortion referendum. Now, you would think from the history of both the issue in our country and the history of Ireland itself, that this could have been a poisonous, toxic issue that divided the country, that was dominated by extremes, and would still be reverberating round the country as something that was divisive and pulling people apart. But because the Irish government set up a Citizens' National Assembly, it was 99 people who met to look at the issues, to see where there was common ground, to find out how their hopes and their fears could be answered. People who were, half of them pro-abortion, half of them against abortion. And because they were prepared to look at the issues in detail and try to thrash out where the disagreements could be resolved, it ended up with a consensual process, respect for each position, a referendum that was actually one where people were civilized in the way they discussed things with each other, And of course, in that citizens' assembly itself, instead of a half supporting abortion, by the time they had ended their discussions, it was only a third, and 2/3 supported abortion reform, exactly what happened that surprised people and astonished the world when the referendum finally gave the result. And you know, that's a model for what we could do here and should have done some years ago when we were discussing this issue. You ask the select committees of the House of Commons to set up these representative groups. You get people half representing Brexit, half not Brexit, and you try to look at immigration, look at sovereignty, look at the control of money, look at what it means for the health service, look at what it means for manufacturing, and I tell you, you will get a different answer after a weekend of discussion with members of the public looking in detail, as they never had the chance to do because of the inflammatory language of the referendum, and you will get to an answer that I believe is more in line with what you and I think about how this issue should be resolved. And so, yes, it's difficult, and yes, it's not the usual way of doing things, but if we're going to solve this problem, and particularly unite the nation, we've got to do something that is different from what we're doing today. And then you put it back to Parliament. They can't contract out their final responsibility for this, but they would, in my view, decide to renegotiate with the European Union. Would the European Union accept a renegotiation? Of course. You saw that this week. When the vote happened, they didn't say, we've got the withdrawal agreement and it's not changing, only. What they said was, we're waiting for a positive proposal from the United Kingdom. And yet, it's not going to come because the Conservative Party cannot agree on what it is. And then, the obvious thing to do, if the situation has changed, and you can show the country, you're arguing for a referendum not on the basis that you're trying to just rerun the old debate. You've got new information, new initiatives, new insights, and that is what you're asking people to decide on. The situation has changed, and it's only right that the people of this country should make up their mind. Now, I believe that there are two views of Britain that are competing with each other and have got to be resolved, and I think we can resolve what is the view of Britain moving forward. The first view is obviously the Brexiteers' view. Britain isolated, alone, self-sufficient unto itself. A Britain that almost glories in isolation. And you know, they quote all the famous history of England in particular, but of Britain as a whole, in justification of this case. Shakespeare, John of Gaunt, Richard III, the Sceptred Isle, you know, in the Silver Seas. And they quote that phrase about how at the White Cliffs of Dover, we are the defensive moat that repels the invaders of the world. But if you actually look at what even Shakespeare said in that, he talks about renowned for our deeds far from home, dear for our reputation throughout the world. It's not even that an isolationist poem or stanza. That is internationalist too. And I tell you, the second view of Britain is the one that we must now champion. And that is a Britain that prides itself in being outward-looking, open, engaged with the world, and internationalist. The Britain that actually helped defeat fascism in Europe, the Britain that intervened in Europe so that we could have the European Convention of Human Rights, the Britain that supported the Eastern European countries as they became democracies in their own right, the Britain that is better leading in Europe and not leaving in Europe. And that's why I come back to this fundamental issue. It is about whether you want cooperation or confrontation, whether you're an internationalist or whether you're an isolationist. And you know, I give this final example. We could talk about what happened after the Second World War, but let's talk about a more modern example. Let's talk about how, for 30 years, we had a space race between Russia and America. And we still have these countries that are actually aggressive against each other. But they decided in the 1980s that the space race was something that had to be put aside. There had to be cooperation in space. And so in this most vital area, but sensitive area where they'd fought for years, we've got an international space station that lasted for 30 years since then and continues to last, where you have astronauts from Russia and America and astronauts from 17 other countries over time sitting in this international space station. And you know, to get to that space station, America is now dependent on Russian launchers and couldn't do it without them. And to man the space station, Russia is dependent on American technology. And if we can find a way, surely, to cooperate in outer space, in an area where there was a space race to the finish for 30 years, surely we can find a way to base a new relationship with Europe that is on cooperation and on an international outlook. I say to you that this issue is fundamental to our future. We either cooperate or we'll end up with confrontation. We are either internationalist or isolationist. You know, I met Anthony Burgess, the great novelist, at the Edinburgh Book Festival before he died. And he had written this book, Clockwork Orange. And Clockwork Orange is this book that, as many of you have seen the film based on it, is about an endless cycle of despair and disaster, mainly violent, but a young man who gets into terrible trouble. And Anthony Burgess sold the film rights for the book, and when he was asked to sell the book to America, the publisher said, could you just give us chapters 1 to 20 and forget about chapter 21? And Burgess was so desperate for the money that he took the money and he agreed that the book in America would be chapters 1 to 20, omitting 21. And he allowed the film rights to be sold on the basis of the book to America. And so we had this picture of this endless cycle of violence. And Burgess regretted it for the rest of his life, because chapter 21 was moving from the endless cycle of despair to the redemption of that young man who realized that his violent life he had to set aside now that he was becoming a father. And the book was always presented as about endless disaster and decline. And in fact, the book was intended to be about redemption as a result of making bad decisions and then changing your mind. We now need a chapter 21, like Burgess did and then regretted giving away. We need a vision of our country in the world where we cooperate, where we're outward-looking, where we're engaged. I believe meetings like this, and I'm so glad that so many people have come this evening, and I thank you for doing so, are the beginning of saying to each other, we can build a better country. We can be the part that we want to be of a Europe that's moving forward, and we can play our proper part then in the future of the world. Thank you very much.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed. And I think you can see from the response you got there, everyone appreciates your words. Now, we're going to move on to another part of the meeting. And I just want to say a few things before we start that I have to do. We're not expecting a fire alarm. But if we are, you know how to do it now, because you've practiced already. The second thing is, this isn't a political meeting, and the audience is made up of people who have ended up on Daniel Johnson and I's EU mailing list. So there might be leavers in the room, remainers, people who are not quite sure to be leave or remain, but it's not a political meeting, so we can have an open dialogue of questions that we'll come to later on. And all I would ask is that people treat each other with a bit of respect and that we have a comradely discussion about the way forward and some of the issues that we'll have then. So if you'll just join me finally before Gordon leaves in just thanking him again for coming this evening, and we'll get on to the other part of the evening. Gordon, thank you so much.
Yeah,
So we're now moving on to the next part of the evening, which is really your opportunity to put your questions to the fantastic panel that we have here in front of us. But just before I introduce each of them, I would just like to say a few brief words myself. As a politician, I can't stand on this stage and let them have all the airtime. But I think it does say something, first of all, about our community, that people in South Edinburgh come together tonight to discuss such an important issue. And I think it says something about the real strength in our community. But more importantly, I would just like to say a couple of brief things about the situation that we have in front of us. Now, I don't thank Theresa May for very much, but we did book this venue months ago, so I think we do need to thank her for bringing the Brexit crisis to such a neat crescendo for this evening's event. But look, my view on Brexit is formed by two of my fundamental political beliefs. I got interested in politics through my participation in the European Youth Parliament, where I experienced what you can achieve by working together, and also about how differences can be resolved across borders, about how cultural differences can actually lead to strength. And that's what made me fundamentally an internationalist and someone who believes that borders create far more problems than they solve. But the other key point is my fundamental belief is politics is about finding compromise and finding solutions. And this situation we find ourselves in at the moment with Brexit, with the crisis in the UK Parliament, is that politics has failed in that fundamental purpose that it has. And so while I agree with many of my colleagues that we must do everything we can to take an alternative course of action, to get rid of this disastrous government that has led to the situation we are in, I do believe that those options are running out. And I think the people's vote, I think ultimately, is looking like the last chance lying on the table. Yeah. So I think that's what I would just like to say about the situation that we have in front of us this evening. I'll turn to the panel. We obviously have Ian Murray, who doesn't warrant any more introduction than he's already had. But then turning to Alex Cole-Hamilton, I'm very pleased that we've got Alex with us this evening. Alex is a colleague of mine in the Scottish Parliament who represents Edinburgh Western. And I think by having him here, he provides a little bit of cross-party balance, which is extremely useful. We also have my long-term friend, who I first got to know, Catherine, as a fellow student of the University of St Andrews, and she's been a fantastic colleague of mine in the Labour Party and has been a fantastic representative for Scotland in the European Parliament for almost 2 decades. And finally...
doesn't age you.
And finally, I think we're very lucky to have Nicola McEwan here. Very much providing an objective perspective. Nicola McEwan is a professor of politics at Edinburgh University. She's co-director of the Centre for Constitutional Studies and has also been very involved in the ESRC project, UK in a Changing Europe. So Nicola is very much here to provide the counterfoil to the politicians we have in this, on the panel, and I think provide that context. So without further ado, I will just like each of the panel members, if they could maybe just briefly open with a few comments of around 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll come to the questions. So we'll start with Ian.
Great. Thanks, Dan. If you don't mind, we may sit for this to try and make it slightly more formal. And my heart was in my mouth every time Gordon got to about an inch from the front of that stage. So maybe we don't want to be losing anyone at this particular stage into the pit. Let me just say a few things. I think what I'll concentrate on is what's been happening at Parliament this week, why we're in this position at Parliament, and what will be happening in the coming days and weeks ahead. Let me start with why we're here at this moment in time. Really, what the Prime Minister's had to do is negotiate a deal with the European Union within the red lines that she set herself. And I've been saying, and cross-party, including the Liberal Democrats, have been saying for some time, for 18 months or so, that the government should have come and sought a cross-party consensus before they started the negotiations, so that Parliament could be in a position of setting the ground rules before she started. And we have this strange... and why the defeat this week was so large, the largest defeat of any sitting government in history, and that's 1,000 years of parliamentary democracy in this country, is that we have a spectrum of how you deal with leaving the European Union. Now, anyone who wants a no deal is at the one end of the spectrum where there'll be an awful lot of pain, economic pain and social and cultural pain, or you get to the other side of the spectrum where the closer you go to the other side of the spectrum, you reduce that pain and cost, but then you have to ask yourself, what's the point? So at the other end of the scale, you've got staying in the single market and the customs union and staying as close to the EU institutions as you possibly can. And wherever you draw yourself on that particular spectrum, you'll either have more economic pain or less economic pain. Now, what the Prime Minister has done is negotiate a divorce agreement. She hasn't negotiated a deal, incidentally. She's only negotiated the divorce agreement with a political declaration. She's drawn herself on that spectrum that is neither please Remainers or please Leavers, and ended up with such a heavy defeat. And that's where we've got to this week. She's ended up with the worst of all worlds. So what's going to happen from now on? Well, let's not forget that had Parliament not come together and passed what we now call the Grieve Amendment last year for a meaningful vote, we would never have had this vote last night, on Tuesday night at all. The vote would just have gone through on the Prime Minister's nod, and there would have been no parliamentary scrutiny in that process at all. So thankfully, Parliament came together to narrowly win that vote, and I think we won it by 2, if my memory serves me right. Now what the Prime Minister has to do, and this is because we won another vote last week, another Dominic Grieve amendment, the Conservative MP for Beaconsfield, who we're working very closely cross-party with at the moment, to try and bring what the Prime Minister has to do next back within 3 days. The EU withdrawal agreement says 21 days with an extra 7 days for parliamentary debate. That would have taken us too far down the line. We've got 36 sitting parliamentary days till Brexit as we sit here tonight. That's been reduced to 3 days, so the Prime Minister has to come back by Monday, which she has programmed in, to do a statement on the way forward. And on Tuesday of next week, she will place a motion in front of the House of Commons, which has been forced upon her again by cross-party amendments to the bill, which will be amendable and votable. So we'll be in this position again next week with what Parliament has to do. Now, here comes the problem. What do we do next? There is no majority in Parliament for any type of Brexit. The only majority in Parliament there is to stop a no-deal Brexit, which the Prime Minister should have ruled out by now. And secondly, for not the Prime Minister's deal. That's the only 2 majorities we have in Parliament. So we have to try and find a consensus around some of those issues, and that's going to have to be done between now and Tuesday of next week. I think what has to happen now is Article 50 has to be extended or postponed or revoked, whichever language you wish to use, because we're running out of time. And then we have to get to, in my view, handing it back to the people. And the reason I say that is twofold, and I'll finish, Daniel, after these 2 points. Parliament is going to try and cobble something together. And I'm not sure this issue is the kind of issue where you cobble something together. And I think the only way we're going to be able to break that deadlock in Parliament and make sure that Parliament doesn't cobble something together is to put it back to a democratic vote of the people. Now, that is controversial in a lot of instances, but what we have to try and do, and I'm sure there's nobody in this room that would ever vote for me or any candidate, politician again, if I turned up on your doorstep with a handful of leaflets and said, vote for me, I'm going to make you poorer. And I think if we do want to go down the route of leaving the European Union, we have to say to people, we understand you voted to leave, we respect the fact that you voted to leave, but this is not the Brexit that you wanted, and therefore we should go back to you to say whether or not you think you want to take the decision to remain in the European Union, because nothing we can offer is as good as what we currently enjoy as a member of the European Union. And Gordon touched on all the issues that were made in 2016, and we can go over them tonight, and maybe some of my colleagues will, in terms of what happened in 2016 that have now been impossible to deliver. So I think we should go back to the people with a people's vote. I think Parliament should vote for that. I think we should put to the people the question, do we want the deal that has been negotiated by the Prime Minister because she's unwilling to move on the red line so we can't renegotiate anything else, or do you want to remain in the European Union? I think that's a very democratic thing to do, and it may just stop us from inflicting upon ourselves the biggest piece of economic self-harm this country's ever seen. Thank you.
Alex, would you like to make a brief introduction?
Well, thank you, Dan. And can I thank you also for your kind words at the top of the meeting and the invitation tonight. You described me in more favourable terms than I usually get. The Daily Mail described me as somebody who looks like a solicitor and sounds like a minor member of the royal family. My mother uncharitably suggests that's as close as I'm going to get to power as a Liberal Democrat, but there you go. No, why am I here? Why is a Liberal Democrat sharing a panel with members of other parties, and well, predominantly the Labour Party in this case, but other parties across the board? And the answer is quite simple. We stand right now at an inflection point in the history of our nation. This is a moment in time in the story of these islands which is far bigger than any one political party, and so too must our response to it. And that is why I was very proud and honoured to be asked to join these people tonight, not least because they're my friends. It's very easy in politics to assume politicians hate each other, but I get on with them very well. But also because we share, I believe, a fundamental understanding of the route out of this national calamity in which we find ourselves. And Ian has just articulated very well the case for the people's vote. I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now and where I think we need to get to, and what those of us in this room who believe in Remain and believe in the principles of the European Union must do to see that vote realised and us returned to membership of the European Union. Hands up here who believes in unicorns. Come on, there's always a couple. Oh, there's a couple at the back. That's fantastic. I'll introduce you to my 4-year-old daughter. You'll get on really well. They're searching for a unicorn in London right now. They are. And it's trying to cobble together a hodgepodge of warring factions, firstly within the Conservative Party. And let's remember that the referendum on our membership of the European Union was designed as a solution to end a generations-old civil war within the Conservative Party. How well has that gone? Not particularly well. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said this very afternoon, good luck, representatives of Britain, in trying to implement something that just does not exist. And I'll tell you why. There's several things, several permutations. We hear about taking no deal off the table. I absolutely support Jeremy Corbyn's call for Theresa May to remove no deal from the table. There is a majority, as Ian has said, in Parliament to remove no deal from the table, but she will not do that because it will destroy her party. The right-wing Brexiteers will leave the Conservative Party in a heartbeat if their ultimate prize is taken away from them. Secondly, there is the same can be said for a customs union. There are other wings of the Conservative Party that will depart if we start entertaining seriously the idea of a customs union. So any permutation of Brexit on top of the deal that she has negotiated cannot be better than the deal we currently enjoy. I remember my good friend and mentor Charles Kennedy used to say that Paddy Ashdown was the only trained killer he'd ever met because Margaret Thatcher was self-taught. But like her or loathe her, Margaret Thatcher negotiated the steal of the century in the deal that we have with the European Union, the rebate that we receive, and in all of the access to the 4 freedoms that the European Union represents. And I think what this is going to come down to, because I do believe that ultimately the only solution will be to put this back in the hands of the people where this first started, in the quiet solemnity of the polling stations of this country in a people's vote. Because I believe that when credited with the facts, people will return us to membership. But that won't happen in isolation. I presume there's quite a lot of Remainers in the audience. Can I hear from you if you're a Remainer? Yeah. It's good to hear. Yeah, clap. Yeah, let's clap the Remainers in the room. Well done. So it is imperative that we begin making the case for restoring our membership of the European Union now. We've been doing it for ages. We need to do it now. We need to forget any notion of Project Fear. We need to begin Project Hope. We need to talk about the stories of why we are passionate Europeans. And I will close with why I'm a European. My first speech to the Scottish Parliament took place on an important anniversary for my family. On that day, 100 years previously, my great-uncle, a private in the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles out of Saskatchewan, was killed on the first day of the Battle of Montserrat with 80% of his battalion. That sacrifice was matched a generation later by the passing of 2 of my grandfather's 4 siblings, this time on European battlefields in World War II. And I think it a measure, friends, of the success of this European project that I am only the 2nd generation in the recorded history of my entire family to never have to contemplate war with Europe. And it is a comfort I would extend to my children and theirs to come. And it is... It is from that desire for a shared and continuing lasting peace that we saw the Coal and Steel Community, the first treaty of European Union, created so that no country in Europe could ever again build a war machine without the knowledge of the others. That then led to the Treaty of Rome, and with it, the most important charter for freedom that this world has ever seen. In the free movement of goods, people, capital, and services, we can live where we want, marry where we want, work where we want, retire where we want, and get sick where we want, in the comfort that we do it in a sorority of nations that has never existed in the lifetime of this planet. This is our Everest. These next few weeks, we are at base camp now. We have many hurdles and setbacks to come. But I fundamentally believe that when the majority is allowed to give voice to the will of the people, as I believe it exists in the UK Parliament, then people, in the solemnity of the polling stations where this first started, will, in that quiet contemplation, recognising all of the arguments that we have put forward of hope for the European Union, finally restore our membership of this great union. Thank you.
So how to follow that? But I think that, you know, what Alex is saying about the European Union being the most successful peace process that we've ever known, where nations that used to fight one another come together of their own free will. And in my time in the European Parliament, I've seen countries which were part of the Soviet bloc come into the democratic hold, and that is something so magical and brilliant that is, where else would that have actually happened if it weren't for the European Union? And so you look at it, you know, you look at Greece, look at Spain, Portugal, former dictatorships come into the democratic fold, again, welcomed, put together and work together so that we can make decisions, because at the moment in this global world that we're in, only by working at a European Union level can we solve some of the great challenges that we face, whether that's climate change or issues around development or holding countries to account in terms of finance or whatever it may be. We can do that as a union, a democratic union of 500 million people. So I wasn't going to actually say some of this, but I do think it's so important to be working in it. You talk to my colleagues in the European Parliament, they don't want us to leave. They enjoy what we do because we work hard, we make a contribution, and we actually are people who have a vision of things that matter. And if you look at the single market, if you look at issues around how we work, live, we drove much of that agenda. And to lose us is something they don't want. But looking at where we are now, we now see what Take Back Control is. It's a 590-page document with a political declaration attached. And I think now is the time to say, do people want that, or don't they want that? And I have to say, if we look at the deal we have, and you outlined that, and so did Ian, and so did Gordon, the deal we have as a full member of the European Union is something that we have influence over, we have representation, we have a say, and if we leave the European Union, we will not have representation, we will not have a say, we will not have a seat at the top table anymore, we will be diminished and we will lose influence at a time when we need greater influence, when we've got Trump in America and Putin in Russia, a growing China, in a world where we need to be strong, and the only way we can be strong is remaining part of the European Union of 500 million people having a say and influence at the top table. So my argument tonight is, I think we have to have a people's vote. I mean, if you think about it, Tuesday, we have the most historical vote in the House of Commons history, 100 years, the government is defeated. 24 hours later, we have a vote of confidence in the same said government, and what happens? People vote, people. And it's very confusing, especially for my colleagues in the European Union, going, what is going on? 5 years ago, you were pretty stable, and then David Cameron, thinking he's going to never have to deliver this, goes for a referendum. He's out having a run yesterday morning thinking, well, I've got no problem with any of this, and you think, my goodness, what have you done? There's a reason why referendums are illegal in Germany. I think sometimes we have to reflect upon that. But I thank you all for coming out tonight. And yes, Daniel and Ian, you were very fortuitous for organising this evening, because I think that we do have to come together at a moment of crisis, and this is a moment of crisis for our country. Our democracy is not in a good shape, and we have to look at it, and we have to put it back to the people to make the decision. Do you want this, or don't you? And my argument is, you certainly don't. Thank you. I can follow you.
Nicola.
Thank you very much. I did ask Daniel if I could talk last, but now following 4 speakers like that, I'm beginning to get it. We talked a lot about the scenes the other night in the Commons, but one of the scenes that really struck me took place outside of Westminster, where you had very flamboyant, maybe is that the right word, competing groups of passionate pro-Remain groups and passionate pro-Leave groups. And when the vote was announced and the result was announced, they all cheered. And that tells us something. It tells us that people opposed the withdrawal agreement for very different reasons. For me, I think there's quite a lot of misunderstanding about what we mean when we talk about Theresa May's deal. Catherine mentioned the 590
something like that.
pages, something like that. I don't know how many of you have read the text. I don't know how many parliamentarians have read the text. I've read it a few times, because that's the kind of fun thing you have to do as a university prof. I'm only beginning to get my head around it. It's incredibly complex. But the key thing I wanted to emphasize is that the withdrawal agreement is only the divorce settlement. The future relationship is all still to be negotiated, and the political declaration that was attached to it, which was very short, about something like that, so of generously spaced text, tells us nothing. It tells us nothing about what the future relationship would look like. And I think that's been part of the problem. I think the Prime Minister has tried not to alienate any particular faction and navigate a way through. The problem with that approach is that all of the different sides have seen in the documents their worst fears, because it hasn't ruled out the things that they wanted it to rule out. So we know in the next week or so, there will be cross-party negotiations to try to come to some sort of compromise position, which will be extraordinarily difficult. I read carefully Jeremy Corbyn's speech that he gave today, where he indicated that he would only participate in those talks if no deal was ruled out. Well, the opposite of no deal is to agree a deal. And for me, there are considerable flaws in the proposition that the Labour Party at leadership level has suggested. For example, the party wants a customs union. That's already in the withdrawal agreement, at least for the transition period, but a customs union that gives the UK a say over the deals that would be made. That's not particularly realistic. It wants all of the benefits of the single market, but with an end to free movement. Now, that's not very realistic either. So I do think it's incumbent on all of the parties to put forward proposals that are actually realistic and not chasing the unicorns, as Alex mentioned. My final point was just a word or two on a people's vote. We've had three people here advocate a new referendum. We had very interesting ideas suggested by Gordon Brown on citizens' assemblies in advance of that. What a pity that that wasn't the approach that was taken in 2016. I wonder about the feasibility of it now going forward, given the context that we are all in. But referendums take time, okay? When you have the legislation, it takes at least 22 weeks. The shortest time that we have had in this country was the alternative vote referendum that took 9 months. So whatever deliberative process was to take place, if any, it would require the consent of the EU to extend the Article 50 process to facilitate that. It'd be interesting to hear Catherine's thoughts on how realistic or otherwise that might be. But there are issues around a referendum. Do you have one question or do you have two questions? What precisely are the options that would appear on the ballot paper? And there are not clear views on that, and I would like to hear clarity from those who are advocating that. And what are the consequences? If Remain was an option and it won by 51 to 49, does that make the country any less divided? What if Leave wins again, but you still have the fragmentation across the different territories of the UK, with Scotland and Northern Ireland favouring again a Remain vote? So Lots of complications, lots of difficult issues, I think, to work through, and I really look forward to the discussion we're going to have tonight. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Very good. Good to see you.